Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. I normally put the bull market support videos out on Sunday night or Monday morning, but we had the beauty of mathematics video to do because it was the first of the month, so it's a little bit delayed. With that said, I do want to jump into this because this is a very important time, I think, in the markets. And we've talked about this back test of the 20-week SMA for a long time. It does seem like that has played out now. And now the only question is does it hold it as resistance or will something else happen and the bulls break through? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about kind of our prior expectations, where we have come so far today, and then we're going to look closely at some of these key levels to keep an eye on here over the next few weeks. So if you remember a few weeks ago, so basically in about, I think, early to mid-September, we speculated that Bitcoin would get some form of a rally into its death cross, right? Guys, I don't name these things. You can call it whatever you want. But that's what most people refer to it as. And so just so people are aware of what we're talking about, it is the 50-day SMA crossing below the 200-day SMA. And we speculated back then that what would likely happen, and I think we made the video like right here, we said what would likely happen is we would pump up a little bit, go down, then rally into the death cross, put in a lower high, and then fade. And I mean, the receipt is here, right? I mean, this is what we said, right? Go up a little bit, fade down, go back down to sweep these lows, go up into the death cross. And the reason we sort of projected it out to go to the 28 to 29K level is because that's where the bull market support band is, right? That was where the 20-week SMA more or less was. And so that was why we talked about that. And we also said the reason it could go there is because oftentimes, if it does play out like a typical death cross rally, oftentimes what'll happen is it'll actually move back up to near where the breakdown occurred, okay, before putting in a lower high, slowly fading, and then going to a new low. Okay, so when we go look at Bitcoin, you can see that has played out relatively well so far, right? Go up a little bit, down, sweep the lows, go up, fade, lower low. Right? So go up a little bit, fade. We did not take out this low, but we did at least more. We did come down here and sort of retest those lows, then rally into the death cross, right? So literally on the day of the death cross, that's when it marked the bottom, the local bottom. And we suggested that what often happens with death crosses is people will see the headline and say, oh, that means it's time to sell. But what often happens in the short term is that it ends up being a good time to buy in the short term for short-term traders, right? Buying on the death cross day in that low often tends to be a good day to sort of get into it if you want to at least take a short-term trade. And then what happens is we do the reverse of what people are expecting in the short term, right? So like over here, when we talked about it, we said we do the reverse of what most people would expect. And so we have, right? We went up, even though most, would have seen death cross rally and maybe would have assumed that we immediately have to go down. We did not. We first went up to the 50-day, and then we went up to the 200-day, right? And so then the question is, of course, well, how does this end? Do we get, does this end up being another lower high? Does it end up being something different? I'm still of the opinion, I could be wrong, right? I get things wrong. You guys know that. I'm of the opinion that it will likely result in a lower high for Bitcoin. It's similar to like the Ether Bitcoin pair, and I've been getting into arguments with people on Twitter about that thing for the better part of a year and a half at this point. But one of the things that I look towards when I look at the Ether Bitcoin pair, I mean, I try to tune out all the noise that's coming from crypto Twitter, where they're constantly bullish on this thing. And I just look at it and I'm like, this has just been a series of lower highs and lower lows, right? And at some point, I think this will break to the downside. Okay. I don't know if it's going to break down now. I know a lot of people think it's going to break out to the upside. Last cycle, it broke down. I think it'll likely break down to the upside. But what's fascinating to me is that every single pump, every single one, everyone comes back to defend it and say, hey, it's actually this metric's really bullish, and then it ends up just being a lower high, and then we eventually put in a lower low. So something like that I think could play out with Bitcoin, where we've already put in this high here, right? So we put in this high, and then we put in this lower high. And I said back, I believe in this video, I believe it was either this video or the next one we did on the Death Cross Rally, which came like just about a week later or so. I think it's unlikely for us to put in a new yearly high. I think the yearly high is in. I could be wrong, right? I mean, like, let's just say it. I could be wrong. I get things wrong plenty. But I think it's more than likely that the yearly high is in. And one of the reasons I think that is because, if you go back and look at say 2019, the yearly high came in the summer. If you look at 2011, the yearly high also came in the summer. Let me go to a different chart that has a little bit more history here so we can see this. So if you go back all the way to 2011, you'll note again that the yearly high in fact came in the summer, right around that June to July timeframe. And so that is one of the reasons why I've said I think that this time around we'll see it play out in a very similar fashion, where it does end up being the yearly high, and we just go down. It's kind of like it's kind of like Litecoin. I know that what are you talking about Litecoin, right? But we said a long time ago that what often happens with Litecoin is that it rallies and then fades about a month or two before it's halving, right? How many times did we say that on all the altcoin reckoning videos we did? And we said it so much, right? And then look what happened with Litecoin. The halving was in August, right? And when did it top out? In July, June or July, just like it always does. Just like it always does in its halving years. It tops out in July, June or July. 2019, it topped out in June. And in 2015, we'd have to go back and find a different chart that has a little bit more data. But you'll see the same thing, right? And here's a chart that I normally use, right? And you can see the circles are still up there, right? We normally top out. Yellow lines are the halvings. Top here was in July, fade into the halving, and then just kind of become relatively boring. Same thing over here. Top before the halving, then become relatively boring. Here, top before the halving, then become relatively boring. So, when it's at that moment, a lot of people don't think it's going to play out like that, right? They say, oh no, the halving's coming for Litecoin, and they'll bull post about it. And then now what? Like, I mean, it's dropped, 50% when it went down to this week, dropped 50% from the high. So for Litecoin, we can see that it's already played out, right? I mean, this is very, very unlikely to see new highs this year. So I think you can kind of see these patterns emerge in the cryptoverse where, at the time, most people don't want to believe it, but oftentimes it does play out in a very similar fashion. And so the idea behind the Death Cross rally is what normally happens is you rally into the Death Cross, right? You rally into it, but the overall trend remains the same. It's sort of like the Golden Cross rally, right? Or sorry, the Golden Cross dump, right? You had a dump into the Golden Cross, but the general uptrend remained intact. It remained intact. Pump out of the Golden Cross, dump. So Golden Cross hit, market dumps, people sell because the market dumps, and then the market keeps moving higher. Now we ended up getting another low over here. So we maybe should keep that in mind, especially if Bitcoin does roll over and come back down here to say 22, 23K, it doesn't mean that it can't rally back up again. But that is something to keep in mind, is that when we had the Golden Cross, we had a drop followed by a more sustained pump over the next several months. With the Death Cross, we had a pump into it, and arguably there will be a longer downtrend going into the end of the year. And look, there's tons of critics of this theory. I mean, if you spend 1 minute on crypto Twitter, everyone has been bull posting all year, and you'll see that, and every time there's a move up, everyone gets really excited, especially when it comes to celebrating lower highs on altcoins. But what I see normally happens in pre-halving years is we wreck both sides. We wreck the bulls and we wreck the bears. And the reason is because both sides get overly cocky, right? Both sides get an ego. It represents all of us, right? Not just you, not just me. It represents more or less all of us. Both sides ultimately get some form of an ego where they think that there's no way that it can do the opposite of what they're expecting, right? There's just simply no way, and then it does. And what often happens is that Bitcoin goes up long enough to wreck the bears and to give the bulls a false sense of security in pre-halving years. And then just when they develop that false sense of security, when they were up here posting about 40K, what ultimately happens is that then we go down. And then they come out at each subsequent lower high to act like this was a normal sell-off and then it's likely just going to keep going higher forever, or for another year or two. So just be careful with this sentiment. The same people bull posting now and saying there's no way it's a death cross rally were the same ones that were telling you that when we were at 31K we were going to go up to 40K. Okay, so the biases don't really change, right? I mean, if a lot of people, if they're bullish, they remain bullish. If they're bearish, they remain bearish. But I think that pretty much goes for most people. But in my own experience in pre-halving years, what we normally do is we wreck the bulls and we wreck the bears. And so I think the most likely outcome is this one, right? Where it ends up being a lower high, we fade and go back down. That is what I think is the most likely outcome. That doesn't necessarily mean that this has to be the high, but it certainly could be. Bitcoin, or the lower high. Bitcoin has this habit, and I've actually shown this a few times, especially on the ITC premium stuff when we're just sort of stuck in ranges, is what often happens is Bitcoin will do this thing where it will set a low and it will set a high. And then, over the next several days or weeks, what will happen is after it sets a low and it sets a high, it will then sweep both of them, right? So you set a low, you set a high. You then sweep the low, and then you sweep the high. So what happens in this time period? It's the local version, the localized version of what's happening for the entire year, right? So what's happening for the entire year? Both bulls and bears get wrecked. So we're all sufficiently wrecked. What's happening on lower time frames? Both bulls and bears get wrecked, right? I mean, every time we come down here, the bears come out and say, I told you so. Then every time we come up here, the bulls come out and say, no, we told you so. And then we go back down and sweep the lows, and then the bears say they were right. And then we go back up and sweep these highs, and then the bulls say they were right. But what happens? What was the net result of all of it? We just wreck both sides, right? You wreck both sides. It doesn't matter if you were a bull or a bear over the last month and a half. Both sides keep getting wrecked, right? You go down, you wreck the bulls, and you go up, you wreck the bears. You go down, you wreck the bulls, you go up, you wreck the bears. So this thing that we're seeing on a lower time frame is what I think is happening on a larger time frame. You put in a low, and then this was a high, and then we swept the high. I'll leave the rest as homework. But that, I think, is something to consider. I think it's something to consider because we've seen these things play out constantly. You can also see it over here. I mean, like, this is also a pattern we saw over here, right? So, like, look at this. You put in a high right here. You put in a high. Sorry, let me switch this over to an arrow. Put in a high. You put in a low. You sweep the high. You sweep the low. It just keeps happening on all sorts of time frames where you put in a high, you put in a low, and then you sweep the high, and then you sweep the low. Right? Keeps happening. So that, I think, is something to consider because it really is. When you look at it on a lower time frame, it really is representative of what we've said all along will likely happen in the pre-halving year, is that we wreck both sides. We wreck the bulls and we wreck the bears. And I think it is happening on higher time frames. And we said that Bitcoin could easily top out halfway through the year, which is what it did in 2011. It's what it did in 2019. And then what happens if it spends the second half of the year going down? I know right now people don't want to believe that because we're in a local uptrend, right? But remember, in this uptrend over here, we actually spent a decent amount of time going down, if you think about it, right? Like, if you were to look at this uptrend, a lot of time was spent fading to the downside. In fact, one could argue we spent maybe even more time fading to the downside than we did actually going up. Look at the rallies that Bitcoin had when it was going up. I mean, it was very, very quick, right? Very quick rallies. So we sort of completed those rallies, and then we just faded back down for another month or two before then the market exploded again to the upside. So what if we're doing the reverse of that now, where, now we had this big drop down, and now we're just spending a long time going up that could ultimately result in just another big move to the downside. And then maybe when we get that big move to the downside, we then just spend a long time going up again, only for it to result into another move to the downside. I mean, you can see that pattern. So sort of what I'm arguing is that what's happening on the larger time frame of wrecking both the bulls and the bears in the pre-halving year is also happening on lower time frames, where you wreck the bulls and the bears every single month, right? Why leave it up to the entire year when you can wreck both sides every single month and every single week and every single day practically? So this is why pre-halving years are so difficult for crypto, because, and I think a lot of people are feeling it. And I speak to both bulls and bears. I mean, time-based capitulation is rough, right? Is rough. And the truth is, if you're watching this right now, most of you are probably long-term bullish on Bitcoin, just as I am, right? Bitcoin bears that tune into this channel are likely going to become Bitcoin bulls. And Bitcoin bulls, there are a lot of just perma bulls, right? They always just remain bullish. And more times than not, they will likely be correct, right? But we do have periods where the market goes down. I mean, the market's been going down since July, right? But you do have to remember that if you are bullish and you think I'm wrong, and if I am wrong, then of course you have all the green light to sort of dunk on me. But if I'm right and Bitcoin does go lower and wreck the bulls, then I would not view that as anything that important, right? I mean, so what? Who cares? You might just say, well, so what? I mean, so what if he was right? It doesn't necessarily negate the long-term trend of Bitcoin. So my thoughts are that this likely results in a lower high and that we fade and go down. Why would it result in a lower high? Why? Like, why does that have to be a thing? Doesn't have to be. There's all sorts of reasons that I'm sure we could find to figure out a way that Bitcoin could go up back to 32K. Okay. But the thesis primarily comes from the argument that there is not a lot of liquidity coming into crypto right now, contrary to what popular narratives you'll see floating around the internet, right? Everyone talks about all these spot ETFs and how all these major institutions are buying up crypto and whatnot. But think about it like this. If crypto were seeing such a huge influx of new money into the space, then why has the stablecoin market cap been dropping since May of 2022? Why? So over here, stablecoin market cap was going up a lot, right? Now it's just been going down. This shows, I mean, like if the general public really trusted crypto, right? If they trusted crypto and they felt comfortable at this point, I think they will eventually, right? But if they felt comfortable with crypto right now, then why wouldn't people be comfortable in the stablecoin market? Like, why does the stablecoin market cap keep going down? It's because a lot of people don't trust it. And why should they? I mean, look what happened last year. You can't blame them. And it's not their fault that they feel like this. Probably a lot of them got burned holding some stable coins that maybe just went to zero. So I'm arguing that the reason Bitcoin rolls over halfway through the pre-halving year is because the primary reason that Bitcoin went up in the first place in the pre-halving year was not because there was an influx of new money into the space. It was just simply because people converted their altcoins to Bitcoin. That's why if you go look at most any altcoin, they just are in macro downtrends against Bitcoin, including Ethereum. ETH keeps going lower. You know, we literally put in a new yearly low yesterday on Ether Bitcoin. Yesterday. And look at this. Same, you guys remember what I was talking about? How we put in a low and we put in a high? Look at this. We put in a low, we put in a high, and then you sweep the lows. And you can sweep the highs too, right? That happens as well a lot. But look at that. You put in a low, you put in a high, and then you immediately go back down and you sweep the low. It's a brutal market. It's a brutal market. But go look at most of these altcoins. They've been in macro downtrends against Bitcoin for a long time. I mean, look at ADA Bitcoin. So the reason that Bitcoin is going up, or the reason that it often goes up in the pre-halving year, is not because there's a lot of new liquidity in the market. It's just because people are going away from high risk to lower risk. They're going away from altcoins to Bitcoin. That's why you see these altcoins going lower on their Bitcoin pairs. So like while people keep celebrating every lower high on the altcoins, so like take a look at Polkadot. How many times do people keep celebrating each lower high as if it's the major breakout, right? I mean, it's just been going on all year. Look at 2023. This was February 2023. Lower highs ever since. Lower highs ever since. And even here, people were celebrating. Oh, Dot's, looking at Dot and seeing that it's breaking out. But look what was going on the Bitcoin pair of Polkadot, which is the only thing that matters on Dot. Look, it was putting in a new low yesterday. A new cycle low. So don't get so consumed by new lower highs on altcoins that you miss the message that the market is sending you, and that's that it keeps going lower on its Bitcoin pair. So the argument, and you can look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin to see this, is that this is just a series of lower highs and lower lows. Now, you could make the argument that we've been putting in higher lows since December of 2022, but Bitcoin also did that last cycle. It was putting in higher lows and lower highs, and eventually it broke to the downside. In fact, the pattern is almost identical. Almost. It's not exactly a match, but it's almost identical, right? Where you have a series of higher lows, but you also have a series of lower highs. Do you see that pattern there? Have you seen this pattern before? If you were in crypto last cycle, yes, you have seen that pattern. If you were not in crypto, you can go find that pattern pretty easily. It doesn't mean that it's going to play out the same way. There's no such thing as a sure thing. I can assure you of that. But it's the same pattern that Bitcoin had over here. It's the same one. I know it happened at a different point in the cycle, but it's the same exact pattern, right? More or less. Do you see that pattern? What was Bitcoin doing? Lower highs, higher lows. This low right here did not come all the way down. Just like look at total 3. This one did not come all the way down. Then it went to the top. Bitcoin went to the top. Bitcoin came back down to touch the trend line there, just like total 3 did. It sort of created the trend line, Then it went back up to the top, just like Bitcoin did. Then it came back down to the bottom, just like total 3 did. Then total 3 went back up to the top, putting in another lower high, just like Bitcoin sort of did right here. Then it came back down and then sort of just hung off those lows for a few months. And then what happened? Capitulation occurred in November. Why did it occur in November? Well, liquidity was drying up, right? Liquidity was drying up. And if you look at the weekly for Bitcoin, for Bitcoin back then, what pushed it down? It was the bull market support band, right? Good question. Bitcoin got above it briefly over here in the summer, and then it just sort of dried up, and then capitulation occurred. So why are we comparing altcoins to Bitcoin last cycle? Well, I think Bitcoin is a more mature asset than it was last cycle, but you might even argue that the altcoin market in terms of more public awareness and whatnot might be, say, where Bitcoin was last cycle. So what if total 3 is just simply in this trend right now, where it's just putting in lower highs, locally it's also putting in higher lows. But eventually it could break to the downside, right? Eventually it could break to the downside. Could be boring for a while before that happens, right? Bitcoin was really boring over here. Nothing was going on. We were celebrating every 2% rally to the upside. Bears were celebrating every 2% move to the downside, and no one was winning. And then before you knew it, the floor collapsed and we dropped 50%. So is there any other evidence to support the idea that altcoins could go through this pattern? I think there is. Look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, right? Look at this. I've said this many times. Altcoins are oscillators at best against Bitcoin over a long enough time period. You can probably find some altcoins that don't necessarily fit that bill, but most altcoins are oscillators at best. And so then you would expect the collective altcoin market to be an oscillator at best, where it peaks out at parity with Bitcoin. This is where the altcoin market cap reaches 1 against Bitcoin, where it's the same as Bitcoin. It tops out at parity and it bottoms out more or less at around 25%. It's currently at 46%. Right? It's currently at 46%. What's rejecting this right now? What's rejecting the altcoin market against Bitcoin? Because I know a lot of people are looking at some altcoins. There's a few that are gone up, but it's been going down, right? It's been going down here since August. It's the bull market support band. Look at that. More specifically, it's the 20-week moving average. Do you see how total 3 is just sort of riding that 20-week SMA down? It's struggling to break through. It's struggling. Why is that? Because I think there's just more people converting alts to Bitcoin, and there's not enough new liquidity in the market to support altcoins on their Bitcoin valuations. There's a lot of people that believe in their altcoin and think that it's going to do, that it's going to break out against Bitcoin just because they believe fundamentally that it should. But if liquidity is not coming into the market, then who's the marginal buyer of your altcoin? Who's the marginal buyer if people are still leaving the space, which they are, by the way. You can view the social statistics and see that it's happening. It's still happening, right? But who's the marginal buyer? And so I think that the altcoin market still needs to take this plunge this is against Bitcoin, right? This is against Bitcoin. How does it take that plunge? Well, there's only 2 ways, right? Either Bitcoin goes up and alts don't go up as quickly, or I guess there's 3 ways, right? Either alts go down and Bitcoin stays flat, alts go down and Bitcoin, does something different, right? Whatever. I mean, it could be up or down, but the thing is the idea would be that altcoins underperform Bitcoin. It could also be because altcoins are going up, but Bitcoin's going up quicker. And then the last one, of course, is just Bitcoin could just be going sideways and the altcoin market is dropping, which has happened before. That has happened. In fact, in late 2018, that did happen. Bitcoin was sideways and the altcoin market was collapsing. So I still think that needs to happen. This drop. How do you get that drop? Well, if this broke to the downside, that would probably get you that drop. Because Bitcoin probably wouldn't correct as much as the altcoin market would, right? So, I take all these things together and I say, well, why should I expect anything different? And then the counterpoint, of course, is to say, well, why does Bitcoin need to go back down to these levels over here? Like, why does it need to? Well, it doesn't need to, but there's the macro risk, right? And we've talked about that a lot. And I think that what we normally see in market cycles, most of which, by the way, most of crypto Twitter, including myself, has never experienced a full market cycle because we're just too young. We're too young to have seen it. The last time we really went through a full cycle was back during the financial crisis. Most of us were not even out of college yet. Most of us were not investors. You know, I didn't graduate high school in 2008. So how was I going to know, how to navigate these business cycles, right? Um, so, and even during the dot-com crash, I would have loved to have scooped up some cheap stocks, but my mistake was that I was only 10 years old. How can you take advantage of it? So we have to remember that most of us have never experienced a full market cycle. But the truth in most market cycles is that bonds bottom before risk assets do. And TLT, this one, we've talked about this one a little bit, is putting in new lows today. I said for a long time to the ITC premium people that we would likely see TLT go to the 80 to 85 level. And the reason being because the market will finally start to believe higher for longer by the Fed. They'll finally start to believe it. But once the market finally believes it, it will likely be enough to send the risk assets into a downtrend. And when that happens, that will bring forth the idea of a Fed pivot. And when the Fed pivots, bonds typically start to go up, stocks tend to keep going down, and then bonds bottom first, and then the stock market bottoms. Who knows where crypto bottoms? I would guess I would guess the altcoin market would bottom before stocks do, just because they're more dependent on excess liquidity. And so once liquidity comes back, we would expect altcoins to start doing well again. But that's kind of just the scenario we're living in. And by the way, if you're not familiar with liquidity, we've talked about this a lot. If you actually look at the net liquidity model that we have here, we can, maybe I should switch this to a weekly. What you can do is you can actually, sorry, let me try to move this to this pane up here, right? So you can kind of see here that the altcoin market generally tracks net liquidity pretty well. So if you remember back to those higher lows, but also lower highs, if it breaks down, perhaps where it breaks down to is to wherever net liquidity is at the time. Okay. So that is something that I think we have to, that we have to contend with, is that liquidity is still drying up, right? Look at the dollar rally. Look at this. The last time the dollar had 12 green weeks in a row was in 2014. 2014. Guess when the first correction came? Mid-October. 12 green weeks and then a 2-week correction in mid-October. We're now at 12 green weeks and we are about to enter mid-October. But even if you go back and look at 2014, even though we had a 2-week correction, the market, the dollar continued to explode higher, and it didn't top out until March, which is kind of interesting because that would be just before the halving. And we know that if Bitcoin goes into a more sustained downtrend, if the dollar goes into a more sustained downtrend, that's when Bitcoin tends to do well. But, we basically had this long consolidation period for the dollar, right? I mean, it had a really large move up. This was a fairly large sort of just corrective move, but you could even look at this and call it, Wyckoff accumulation, right? And here's your spring, and now it's moved up higher. At some point, it'll likely get some form of a correction, and then it'll start likely to move up again. But that's where we stand, guys, at least in my opinion. So, I'm not going to be shaken on my views just because Bitcoin moved up a little bit this week. Especially considering this is what we said was likely going to happen, right? We talked about that it would likely, we would likely see some type of death cross rally. So I think that was always going to be the most likely scenario. And now the question is does it end up being a lower high? I think it will be a lower high, but mainly because I just think due to liquidity leaving. And by the way, guys, the S&P, this is a pretty substantial correction here. If this, at some point, you'll likely get a bounce, but just remember, whenever it bounces, it could just be a rejection off the bull market support band. So, you know, you had it here at 4,600, then at 4,500. Maybe you'll go back up and get rejected at 4,400. Maybe it would correspond to a 2-week rally or maybe it would correspond to a 2-week drop by the dollar, right? Which could happen in mid-October. We'll see, but that's where we stand. I think that Bitcoin will likely form a lower high, and then continue back to the downside, and it will likely be just simply remembered as a death cross rally that resolved to the downside. And then we'll have to figure out, you know, at what point the Fed pivots and where we go from there. We'll wrap it up, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, I will see you guys next time. Bye.